Moving on to my top 25, we have from the 7th season of TNG, Lower Decks. I love the premise of this episode, and they tried to do it on an episode of Voyager that didn't quite work as well, but I love the concept of seeing the perspective of junior officers, of people outside the main cast, and how they perceive the main cast and their journey. And I wish we got to see more of this within a series like The Next Generation and expand the exploration of some of the quote-unquote little people on board the ship. So just the premise in itself I found so refreshing at this point in the series and interesting as a perspective that it was already going to be one I was going to enjoy, but it's handled so well to where somehow in the 42 minutes or whatever roughly the runtime is, you get to know these characters to the point where the death of one of them, obviously lots of spoilers in these if you haven't been watching me so far, just getting into it, somehow for a character that you've known for less than an hour, the fact that the death of Sito Jaxa is so impactful. It really, watching this episode the first time, I cried. It's still one that feels like a punch in the gut every time I rewatch it. It really is effective, and you really feel for this character that, again, you've known for less than an hour. And the fact that they're able to pull that off and form a group of characters that you would like to see again and you truly believe exist in this world is fantastic. And I think it's one of the most successful episodes of the last season of The Next Generation. Number 24 from Season 6 of TNG, we have Relics. One of my favorite performances by Jimmy Doohan as Scotty, who is one of my two favorite characters from the original series. Great to see him make an interesting return, a very unexpected return, as the Enterprise D is exploring a Dyson sphere, a concept in itself which is very interesting, has been used many times in various science fiction. It's always kind of a cool idea. They discover Scotty, who has trapped himself in a transporter buffer along with someone else to try and survive, and that it's really a great way of introducing that miracle worker engineer with that interesting concept and idea, and then his coming to terms with his new reality and how he interacts with the crew of the Enterprise, especially Geordi and Picard, but his relationship with Geordi and him realizing how out of place in time he is and how different things are. And you have a very touching moment on the holodeck with Captain Picard as he visits a simulation of the original Enterprise bridge, and something about experiencing Scotty's perspective within this episode has always drawn me in. This has remained a favorite episode to rewatch. Number 23 from Season 5 of Deep Space Nine, we have Rapture. Bajor is finally on the cusp of entering the Federation, and at the same time, Captain Sisko is becoming rapidly obsessed with an obelisk and trying to discover the mystery of the lost Bajoran city of Bahala. And here we see the status of Ben Sisko as the emissary and an important religious figure to Bajor really butt heads with his obligations to the Federation, and that all reaches a boiling point here as Captain Sisko convinces the Bajorans to back out of becoming a member of the Federation because of visions and feelings of the future, and really trying to save Bajor before the coming war with the Dominion. And there are so many ramifications from his actions in this episode to the future of the next 2.5 seasons of the show and Bajor's role. And it really is one of the best examples of him navigating the complex nature of being the emissary and also being an important figure within Starfleet and his different obligations, and a lot of touching moments again too with Jake, who many times feels like he is pushed aside or left out when his father enters these moments where he becomes so enraptured by the spiritual aspects and inner workings of his status within Bajoran culture. And again, a great exploration of uncovering a piece of the past of Bajor, and I love exploring that element. Number 22 from Season 5 of Deep Space Nine, we have Call to Arms, one of the greatest season finales in Star Trek history, as a plan is hatched to set up a minefield stopping the use of the wormhole so the Dominion cannot bring in reinforcements. That is put in place, but of course the Dominion and their Cardassian allies find out about this plan and send a fleet to try and stop them, and we have a huge battle for the fate of Deep Space Nine. And in the meantime, there are a lot of great personal moments and a lot of spots that feel almost like goodbyes, almost like the end, almost like moving on. You have Rom and Lita's wedding. O'Brien sends Keiko and Molly to Earth. A lot of realizing the ramifications of this conflict and things really reaching the point of no return. And then as the battle rages, they actually lose, to where all the Federation officers who are and associates have to leave the station. They evacuate, leaving behind Garrick and Odo and all the Bajoran officers, and obviously Quark and Rom and Jake, who decided against the wishes of his father and his then very angry grandfather to try and stay behind and report on what is happening with this coming takeover Deep Space Nine of this occupation. And it ends up being the beginning of a great growth moment of Jake finding his own way of helping, his own way of resisting, where he's never really a fighter, he's a writer, and him kind of trying to come into his own as well behind the scenes. And it moves into a period of great dilemmas as the people who are left behind try and work within the now occupied station. So it's a great beginning to what many consider to be the best era of Deep Space Nine. Number 21 from Season 7 of Deep Space Nine, When It Rains. Colonel Kira is given a field commission and the authority to speak on behalf of the Federation as she becomes a Starfleet commander. This is partly due to the possibility of her Bajoran rank and commission being a point of conflict on their next mission, as Commander Kira and Odo and Garrick are sent to Cardassia to help the growing rebellion led by Damar, as many Cardassians are finally coming to terms with the fact that their partnership with the Dominion has been running them into the ground, and they're just being used as cannon fodder, and it is not the brilliant collaboration that Dukat sold it as. And it's a great turning point for the Cardassians, and seeing them now being the rebels against this oppressive regime, and who comes to help them but a former Bajoran rebel. They are now the freedom fighters being led and aided by the people that originally they oppressed, and it's just an interesting dynamic. And you get the complications then as we find that Odo has been infected by the disease that is affecting the Great Link, and it's very interesting to see the direction that their efforts take throughout this episode. Number 20, Deep Space Nine, Season 7 episode, The Dogs of War. And I have always loved this and felt very passionate about what this is building to. This is the great build-up to then the finale of Deep Space Nine, and we start to see all the final pieces come into place. And we begin to see them pull the threads together to start to try and wrap up a lot of the ongoing storylines, and it's the beginning of the end. We also find out in that vein that Cassidy is pregnant, and it really is all about beginning to wrap up the ongoing storylines as well as laying the seeds for the possibilities of the future. Number 19 was probably one of, if not the hardest episodes to place on this list, because as far as the quality of the production, the writing, and the acting, if this was a best of list, it would more than likely be in the top 10 and maybe even top half of the top 10. But for our favorites, we have my number 19 choice, Far Beyond the Stars from Season 6 of Deep Space Nine, where Captain Sisko experiences the life of Benny Russell in the 1950s and is a brilliant standalone story in its own right. You could take this episode and show it to someone who's never seen an episode of Star Trek in their life, and it would still be a fantastic story, very well written, a great exploration of this character, of this science fiction writer, and his life in the 1950s and being confronted by racism. And it's such a beautifully crafted episode from start to finish, and it's one of those examples of an episode that can represent the best of Star Trek. Number 18, from the third season of The Next Generation, we have Sins of the Father. I am a sucker for Klingon culture and Klingon politics. I always will be, and this is one of my favorite examples. We have a continuation of a concept introduced in a Season 2 episode that made my favorites list. With the cultural exchange, this time we have a Klingon officer serving aboard the Enterprise D, and we find out that he is Worf's brother, Kurn, played by Tony Todd. And we delve into all the inner political workings of High Council and the cover-up involving Worf's father, and the involvement of the Duras. And this is a huge turning point for Star Trek in general, as it is a very in-depth exploration of the inner workings of the Klingons. It is a big step towards Worf as a character becoming far more fleshed out, and the ramifications of the storyline throughout this episode are felt and revisited for years to come. There are things that are started in this episode that have implications for stuff years and years down the road, and even into things like Deep Space Nine, as this is the beginning of things that would eventually lead to Gowron. You have the introduction of elements that even lead to the movie Generations and the destruction of the Enterprise D. Later episodes of The Next Generation, there are things here that our understanding of how the Klingons work, a lot of it is born here in this amazing episode, and the concept of Klingon honor is explored in a way that is really important to the understanding of Klingon culture. And one of the direct sequels to the events of this are the two-parter ending Season 4 and beginning Season 5 of The Next Generation, my number 17 choice, Redemption, where Klingon politics have now led to a Klingon civil war, and the Duras are being helped behind the scenes by the Romulans, which is even more interesting as it is directly Commander Seelar who is tied to yesterday's Enterprise, and Tasha Yar. So many things, threads from storylines in the first 3 seasons of The Next Generation come to a point here, and I love this entire section. One of my favorite things is to watch the standalone Blu-ray release of this episode that they're edited together as just one continuous episode instead of 2 separate parts, and it feels like a lost Next Generation movie. It's just great, and is one of my favorite Klingon-focused storylines, and is a fantastic look at the divided loyalties that Worf has between his loyalty and his sense of responsibility for his family and his Klingon heritage versus his loyalty to Starfleet. It's one that I think here and in Way of the Warrior are really the two where it comes to the forefront most fully. Number 16 from Season 6 of Deep Space Nine, we have Rocks and Shoals. There are two main elements to this story, the A and B. We have the continuation of the story of Captain Sisko and his crew aboard the Dominion ship. After destroying the Ketracel White facility, they crash land on a planet where there's another stranded crew there, although they are Jem'Hadar and their injured Vorta, and they are very desperate, Jem'Hadar and Vorta, as they're running out of Ketracel White. And you have the standoff between them, which is very tense and exciting, and you get a great understanding of the workings and the relationships of the Vorta and the Jem'Hadar, and the honor and structure of the Jem'Hadar way of life, and how the Dominion works at that level, and the very treacherous and self-important Vorta. And it's just a fantastic, tense and exciting story in its own right. And then you have the B story on Deep Space Nine, which is under occupation still, and you really start to see the struggle, particularly with Kira, of living under that system and what are they doing. And this is really the turning point where they go from going through the motions to truly beginning to decide to act in a more aggressive form. This is the beginnings of a new rebellion against Dominion rule within Deep Space Nine. Number 15, the first episode from Season 7 of DS9, Image in the Sand. It's incredible how much this episode covers. It really feels like multiple episodes. When I think back, if it's been a long time since I've seen it, I often in my head think of it as multiple episodes and realize, wait a minute, everything is just in this one, because they introduce and cover so much ground in the opening to this last season. It's remarkable what they're able to accomplish, and never feels rushed. We have three very important story arcs after the events of the end of Season 6 and the death of Jadzia Dax, as well as the ongoing conflict with the Pah-wraith and being cut off from the wormhole as they are engaged in a battle to control both the Celestial Temple and the effects that it has on Bajor, as there is a rise in a Pah-wraith cult on Bajor. There's a loss of direction and faith for many people as well. So you have the religious element of the Pah-wraith, which ties into the story of Captain Sisko and Jake, as they have been on Earth for months, staying with Jake's grandpa in their restaurant, as Captain Sisko struggles to try and find his path again as the emissary and to reconnect with the prophets. And this is one of the most important episodes for his character, as this journey that he goes through within the context of this episode explains his connection to the prophets and his coming into being, as he has these images of a woman's face in the sand in the deserts of Tyre. And then they uncover an old photo of this strange woman from the visions with Ben's father, and they discover that this was his real birth mother, who he never knew. The woman he grew up and thought of as his mother was his father's second wife. And you learn how the prophets designed Ben's existence, and it's a fascinating experience in him trying to find the orb of the emissary, dealing with a near-death experience in the alley thanks to a member of the Pah-wraith cult, and Oh man, when I saw that episode for the first time and watched my Captain Sisko get stabbed in the stomach, I lost it. I'm telling you. I still remember being fairly young, I guess early teens at the time. And, oh man, I lost it. I was like, no, no, no. And knowing that it's probably the last season, like, oh god, what's going to happen? And you have that entire plot line with a surprise introduction that I'll get to because it also ties in this thing that's been going on this entire time. While they are back on Earth, Worf is having a bit of an emotional crisis. And a lot of that comes from, obviously, his wife just died several months ago, but it gets more complex because through his belief system, the way that Jadzia died, and because she was also very, even though she was a Trill, very strongly attached to Klingon culture and his wife, her death was not an honorable death, not a death that would lead her to Sto-vo-kor. And he's very troubled by that and ends up going, thanks to some prodding by Martok and some of those that were closest to Jadzia in the form of Julian and Quark. They go on a perilous mission in order to secure Jadzia's place in Sto-vo-kor, and that mission in itself could have been its own episode in this journey to honor the memory of Jadzia. It's just fantastic and an exciting space adventure by itself while this drama is going on, the spiritual conflict with Captain Sisko on Earth. And then there's an entire third plot that they somehow weave in here with Kira, who is now in charge of Deep Space Nine in the absence of Captain Sisko, and her dealing with an issue with the Romulans, who want to install a permanent presence on the base. Now they are, partners in the conflict, and the Klingons have a pretty permanent presence there already. So it makes sense, but politically it's a little bit rough because, trusting the Romulans too much. And then the Romulans want to install a hospital on one of the moons of Bajor, and it seems like a fine proposal, and it does save a lot of Romulan lives, but at the same time, the Romulans are stockpiling weapons in that hospital facility. And while there is the believable excuse of having those weapons there for self-defense, at the same time, how comfortable would you be if a strained alliance with a not-so-trustworthy superpower had a ton of powerful weapons very close to your very militaristically inferior homeland? Definitely a very tense situation, which leads Kira to form a blockade, and it's a fantastic moment for her character, and again, lots of ties to what's going on with the war for the Bajoran spiritual realm and the expulsion of the Pah-wraith, and all those tie in then to the reveal to help complete Sisko's journey to find the orb of the emissary. He gets a surprise visitor who is beginning her own new journey. We see Ezri Dax. So all these incredible plot lines, and they're all woven so perfectly enough that each could have been their own episode. This could have been 3 episodes. And then you also get on top of that an extra bonus and a big surprise. We have the new Dax, the introduction of one of my favorite characters in all of Star Trek. So just a brilliant way to start this season. Number 14, also from Season 7 of DS9, we have Afterimage. This episode is largely about Ezri Dax exploring who this new version of Dax is, who this character is, and exploring her new relationships with all these people that she knows from her previous host. And the main ones that really are focused on in this episode are Garak and Worf and Captain Sisko. Also a lot with Dr. Bashir and Quark, but to a little bit of a lesser extent. They're a little more accepting right away of this very different Dax. The strong, confident warrior Dax is no longer, and Ezri is much more meek and physically less imposing to match her new personality trait, and she's also in a very complex situation where normally to become a host, especially to a symbiote that is one of the more famous ones, the Dax symbiote, you have to go through a multi-year process, very stringent testing and training, and you are truly prepared physically and mentally and emotionally for this change, for this fusion to form this new personality, this new being. And because of the situation and the immediate danger of losing the Dax symbiote and everything that happened, Ezri was not necessarily chosen to be the next host for Dax. It just happened to be she was on the Destiny and was an available, viable candidate, and kind of the only thing at the time. And so she did not have that preparation and training. So already something that would be a difficult situation is so much more complex when she has not had that training to integrate all these memories, these lifetimes of memories, and this new part of herself into who she is as Ezri. So she's struggling to find that balance within herself, at the same time dealing with all these external issues, of course, of being in wartime, and then the situation of being, at least temporarily, she wants to go back to the Destiny or even leave Starfleet completely, the situation of being on Deep Space Nine, where her former host was stationed, had a lot of close friends, one of which, Captain Sisko over multiple lifetimes. Her husband is there, and so she has all these complications and trying to find her new space within these relationships. And one of the big issues is Worf, and Worf is dealing with this complex issue of which already we've explored in previous episodes, of trying to avoid being in contact with previous host spouses, and the extra complexity of Worf just finished this mission to get his wife into the Klingon afterlife, and then is she really there or not, because part of her is and part of her will always remain here. It's a very complex spiritual question, because the essence of Trill existence really doesn't compute with a lot of the Klingon spiritual beliefs. It doesn't really translate, and makes an already difficult situation more difficult, because here you have this person who is a complete stranger, yet has all the intimate memories of being married to you, and it's, for both of them, it's very difficult, and they do a great job over the whole season exploring that relationship and balance. And the other big thing that's focused on is Garak, who's going through his own traumatic experience, seeing himself as he's helping the Federation win this war to help save his people. At the same time, the information he's providing he sees as a betrayal, and is ending up in the deaths of many of his own people, and him dealing with the complexities of his situation, and Ezri trying to help him out with that, as she is a counselor in training at this point, which already makes things very difficult. So you're dealing with a lot of characters in emotional turmoil. Alright, here's where things are going to get weird for some people. My next couple, I think. But number 13 is one that I would bet money no one else in their right mind would have this episode anywhere near this high, because it's not a perfect episode, but I'll have to explain why I love it so much. We have, from the 7th season of Deep Space Nine, Field of Fire. And for a lot of big hardcore Star Trek fans, getting a what? Field of Fire. We have a Star Trek murder mystery on our hands with a fascinating concept for a new weapon that ends up in some brilliant shots, where you can literally transport a bullet. So it's a projectile weapon, not a phaser type weapon, a projectile rifle, basically with a mini transporter in the end, so it transports the bullet to the target. And it's a crazy idea. It's really cool, and ends up in, I think, a fascinating murder mystery. And part of why I like it is that I love the character of Ezri, and I love her exploration, and she's still in this stage of figuring herself out and having to bring forth the memories and the personality within her of a former host to try and get into the mind of the murderer and help her solve this crime, as she becomes very involved with the entire situation. And it's just, for me, there's many parts of it that I enjoy. I like, again, the exploration of Ezri as a character through this concept and going through those steps. And I have always wanted to see what it would be like to have kind of a Star Trek NCIS or Law and Order type show. I've always thought of, Star Trek, like a Columbo type thing. I've always enjoyed mysteries and detective things. That's why I like a lot of the Dixon Hill stuff in TNG. I've always been a big fan of especially like murder mystery type stuff, whether it's more comedic, classic things like the Thin Man series from the 30s, or even getting into TV shows like Columbo is one of my favorite shows. And because I love Star Trek so much, I always was curious to see, it would be really cool to have that type of show in the Star Trek universe. I always thought that would be fascinating, and this is really the closest we ever got to something like that. There were a lot of elements in here that immediately I found to be fascinating, and for some odd reason, I have attached myself to that episode and have always come back to it over the years many times over and over again, and wishing we could see more in that style, because I think it's such a cool idea. Number 12 from Season 6 of Deep Space Nine, we have You're Cordially Invited, the marriage of Worf and Jadzia. And this one just ticks so many boxes for me, especially when it very first aired. Watching the premiere for that episode, the previews for that episode, my three favorite Star Trek characters at the time that this first aired were Captain Sisko and Worf and Jadzia Dax. Those are my three favorite characters in all of Star Trek, not just Deep Space Nine, all of Star Trek. And then I see this preview, and this relationship has been building, and I'm like, wait a minute, two of my three favorite characters in my favorite franchise are finally getting married. Already, I'm all in. I'm like a middle-class suburban housewife watching a royal wedding. I'm ready to go. And then it's going to be an episode with a lot of humor, and it's going to be an episode that we get to explore Klingon rituals. We get to have a Klingon wedding, and I'm all about it. Watching these videos, I'm all about getting into Klingon culture. So it just keeps going and going with everything that I want to see. And then tonally, at the time that it takes place, it was a breath of fresh air, because it is an episode that takes a pause from the misery and the dread and the horrors of war and the action and the conflict to celebrate life. It takes a pause in the greater scheme of things to celebrate what they are fighting for, to celebrate the connection and the friendships that everyone has, and to celebrate the love these two characters have, and to reaffirm why they are fighting so hard. And I just love the way that is all pulled off. And then, of course, you have the fantastic humor elements that work so well with the quote-unquote Klingon bachelor party. Definitely a great O'Brien and Bashir episode as well. Some of their moments, I still crack up at kill Worf. Just brilliant. I love everything that it accomplishes, and again, its place within the story and what it does to reaffirm why things are moving forward, and why I love these characters, and why I want to see them come through these greater conflicts. And again, seeing two of your favorite characters get married, and to see that happen in Star Trek, where for the most part there aren't that many marriages between characters. There are a lot of relationships, and a lot of times they're the relationship of the week. There are only a handful of times, and again, one of the greatest examples will always be the O'Briens, of being people that you saw get married, date, get married, have kids, move through those, and just fantastic to see characters make that leap on Deep Space Nine. So I adore this episode. It's one I quote all the time. Martok and his wife Sorella are just great together. My wife loves those two. I feel like if these were real people, I swear my life would leave me for Martok. But it's fantastic. Number 11, before we get into the top 10, is my second favorite series finale from a Star Trek show, Deep Space Nine's What You Leave Behind, from Season 7, of course. The end of Deep Space Nine, the final moments of my favorite TV show of all time. And why it doesn't quite make the top 10, even though 11th favorite out of 800 and whatever something episodes of Star Trek that are out there, is because of the hope for the future that it presented that was never explored on screen. Thankfully, we have many years of novels that basically fill in a Deep Space Nine Season 8 and beyond in the whole Star Trek universe, and very grateful for all of that. But while it is an extraordinary ending to the series and feels very satisfying, and I love the way the Dominion War comes to its conclusion, and there's so much that is finished off and feels like a satisfying ending to a chapter in this greater story of Deep Space Nine and of these characters' lives. It leaves a little bit bittersweet, because it also, while it ends this journey and adventure, it lays the groundwork for the next stage of these characters' lives and the next stage of these journeys. And you never really got to see it again, like not talking about the books, but on screen in a movie form or in a new series or something. And that lingering desire to see more, because it was so darn good. It is a fantastic ending to the series, but you see these characters move on to the next stages of their lives, and you await the return of Sisko, and it just leaves you in those final moments watching Jake and Kira standing on the promenade at the window, wanting there to be more, wanting the first episode of Season 8 to start, and we never got that. And it's very exciting, and there's so much love and connection to all 7 seasons within that, but it also leaves you with a little bit of heartache, and I think that's a good thing. But at the same time, there's one series finale that I like a bit more, that made it into my top 10, because it felt a little more satisfying as a conclusion rather than the conclusion of a chapter.